It's really a matter of showing their dominance.
India's great Chinese conundrum.
Nobody can contain it. Not the United States, not China, not anybody else.
Frenemies. Streaming now.
Hello and welcome to this brand new edition of Global Lens on News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna. As always, we have the top global stories for you. Let's begin with the United States. Well, the news keeps getting worse for Donald Trump. The former US president has been indicted for the fourth time. The latest indictment came from a Georgia grand jury in connection with the investigation into efforts to overturn the 2020 election results in the Peach State. Coming out hard after the fourth indictment, Trump has claimed he will produce an irrefutable report that should lead to all charges against him getting dropped. On his social media platform, Truth Social, Trump said a large, complex, detailed but irrefutable report on the presidential election fraud that took place in Georgia is almost complete and will be presented by me at a major news conference at 11 a.m. on Monday of next week in New Jersey. Based on the results of this conclusive report, all charges should be dropped against me and the others. There will be a complete exoneration. They never went after those who rigged the election. They only went after those who fought to find the riggers. That's what he has said. Now, the charges against Trump were brought by Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis. These include violating Georgia's anti-racketeering law, conspiracy, false statements and asking a public official to violate their oath of office. Right after the indictment, Trump denounced the ruling and called the situation a total shutdown of democracy. In his exact words, these monsters, all controlled and coordinated by the Department of Justice and radical left lunatics, are criminalizing political speech, a total shutdown of democracy, witch hunt, he said in another post. He even called the district attorney failed and corrupt and raised speculation about even the ruling being rigged. Trump went on to say, so the witch hunt continues. 19 people were indicted, including the former president of the United States, me, by an out-of-control and very corrupt district attorney who campaigned and raised money on I will get Trump. And what about those indictment documents put out today, long before the grand jury even voted and then quickly withdrawn? Sounds rigged to me. Why didn't they indict me 2.5 years ago? Because they wanted to do it right in the middle of my political campaign. Witch hunt, can you believe it? This failed district attorney from Atlanta, Fani Willis, where murders and other violent crime soars daily to new record highs, is charging me with 2020 presidential election interference. No, Fani, the only election interference was done by those who rigged and stole the election. Those are the people you should be going after, not the innocent people who are fighting for election integrity, says Donald Trump. Meanwhile, 18 alleged co-conspirators were also indicted along with Trump in the Georgia case, including his lawyers Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, Sidney Powell, Jenna Ellis and Kenneth Chesebro. Former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, ex-Justice Department official Jeffrey Clark, and the former president's 2020 election day Director of Operations Michael Roman. Remember, Trump has also been charged in 3 other criminal cases in Manhattan, Miami and Washington, D.C., while facing a total of 91 counts. Now consider this, the potential prison sentences add up to 712 years and 6 months if Trump were to be convicted in each of these cases. Trump and the other defendants have until the 25th of this month to voluntarily surrender to authorities. A key focus of the investigation is a phone call between Trump and Georgia's chief election officer, in which Trump suggested that local officials could find another 11,000 votes in his favor. While this investigation is a separate state probe, there is some overlap with the federal investigation into Trump's actions after the 2020 presidential election. There's a long list of possible charges in the case, and reports say racketeering, which is mostly used in organized crime cases, could be amongst the most serious. Another high-profile person to have been indicted in the Georgia case is Rudolph Giuliani. The indictment in the election conspiracy case marks perhaps the lowest point in the career of Giuliani, who staked his legacy on blind allegiance to the Trump administration, say experts. Time magazine's 2001 Person of the Year, the then New York mayor, Rudy Giuliani, has gone from America's mayor to, as some say, Trump's attack dog and now a criminal defendant. Well, shifting focus back to Trump. Another significant question being asked is this: will Trump participate in the first Republican presidential debate scheduled to be held on the 23rd of August? Trump says he will not sign the pledge required to participate, but the former president's Republican rivals are actively preparing as if he will be on stage. Former Vice President Mike Pence is hosting mock debate sessions with someone playing the part of the former president. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has been participating in weekly debate prep sessions for several weeks with an eye towards drawing clear contrasts with Trump. And Nikki Haley, the former ambassador to the United Nations, is planning to show she can stand up to bullies. In all, 8 Republican candidates have met the Republican National Committee's fundraising and polling thresholds required to qualify for the debate to be hosted by Fox News in Milwaukee. Trump has said publicly and privately that he's leaning against participating given his big lead in national polls and concerns about the Fox News moderators. Though the former reality television star hasn't ruled out his participation completely. Republican officials in and around rival campaigns believe Trump will end up on the debate stage regardless of the drama in the days leading up to the high-stakes affair. All right. For a perspective on just what's going on with Trump and the presidential campaign in the US, let's now go across to Ramakrishnan Sridharan, consulting editor with News9 Live. He joins us now from Washington, D.C. Welcome back, Sri. As always, great to have you on the show, and a lot to unpack here in this Trump story. Let's begin.
That's right.
Let's begin with the 4th indictment. Of course, Trump's reaction is hardly surprising. What is interesting, though, is that he has threatened to hold a press conference next Monday where he claims he is going to present a quote-unquote irrefutable report that is going to result in his exoneration in this entire case. Now, what do you think we can really expect from this Trump press conference? Is it really expected to be as explosive as he claims?
Well, right now, Neha, this is a mystery report because apart from Mr. Trump, no one else seems to know who has done this report, what's in the report, and how is even an exoneration, as he says, possible unless it's done by some legal authority or by a judicial inquiry. So at this point, it's quite a mystery what Mr. Trump is talking about. Maybe when he holds that much promised press conference, we'll know what exactly is there and who's done the report and what's in the report and how much seriously should anyone take the report. For all you know, it may just be one of those statements that Mr. Trump is prone to making in his own defense, and nothing may really come of it. But, you know, eventually the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So we'll wait for the press conference. But for now, it's quite a mystery who's done the report, what's in the report, and who is Mr. Trump really referring to when he says that he will stand exonerated when the report is made public, Neha.
All right. We'll, of course, have to wait and see what happens when Trump and the other 18 co-defendants, do in fact turn up in court to surrender to authorities. Now, the other big question that's become a topic of discussion, or shall we say debate, Sri, is what happens on the 23rd of August when the first Republican presidential debate takes place. You know, it's very interesting. Trump hasn't even confirmed if he's going to participate. In fact, he's said repeatedly that he doesn't feel the need to take part in this debate, while all his Republican rivals seem to be preparing to take on only Donald Trump in this debate, almost assuming that he is going to be on stage that day. So stick your neck out for us. Is Trump participating or not? What do you think?
Well, that's a hard one. It's $1 million question at the moment, Neha. But let me just break it down into two. One, Mr. Trump's own statement and what he's been saying about the debate. As you mentioned yourself, he hasn't confirmed whether he's going to attend or not attend. He's joked to some of the people saying that he may attend, but only to be in the crowd, not to be on the dais as one of the speakers or as one of the nominees debating the presidential issues. So we don't know really at this point which way he will go. But it's clear that Mr. Trump doesn't have a whole lot to gain from this debate in terms of his own popularity with the Republican Party base. He's quite clearly ahead of every other candidate by far in all opinion polls. So these debates are basically held and seen by nominees as an opportunity to gain lead over some of the weaker candidates. So in this case, Mr. Trump is clearly by far the strongest candidate. So he doesn't have much to gain by actually being part of this debate. Now, that said, Wisconsin is a state which has been very important in the presidential elections. It's been what you call a swing state. In 2016, it voted Republican. 2020, it went Democrat. It voted for Biden, Mr. Biden, President Biden. And we don't know which way it's going to go. But the opinion among Republican voters are also now divided, partly because a lot of people who testified in the election subversion case, the indictment, the inquiry which the Fulton district attorney has been conducting, many of them were actually Republicans. So if Mr. Trump is thinking that just by being Republican, he's going to get all their votes and the support, then maybe he's overestimating their loyalty and their commitment to fair play and fair elections, even though they're Republicans and supporters of Trump. I think at some point, all voters are voting in the interest of the nation, interest of democracy, and they want the US to be a vibrant democracy. So I think from that point of view, it is critical that Mr. Trump should go and debate and be seen as being part of this presidential nominee debate, Neha.
And, I find it absolutely fascinating that if there is one network that has gone out of its way to promote and defend and back and endorse Donald Trump since before 2016, it is Fox News. And now Trump has actually expressed concerns about the moderators from Fox News. I really don't know what he is talking about, but there is another aspect I want to discuss with you, Shri, before we move on from this story. While Trump is the one who's grabbing all the headlines in the US and elsewhere, another individual in this entire case who strikes me as being really significant is Rudy Giuliani. Now, here's a man who had emerged as America's hero, the then New York mayor following the 9/11 terror attacks, the Time Person of the Year. And now, you have New York Times and others saying that he's gone from America's mayor to a criminal defendant. Many call him Trump's attack dog. And the fact that he will now have to defend himself against charges that he was part of a conspiracy to overturn a US presidential election. Would you say that Rudy Giuliani is one guy who probably has the biggest fall from grace in all of this?
It would seem so, Neha, because, Mr. Giuliani was almost worshipped as a role model, as the mayor that all American cities ought to have, because he did clean up. He did get violence, prostitution, drug peddling, everything off the streets of New York. And he did a great job. And ironically, he used the same RICO Act under which he has, and Mr. Trump, they have been indicted in Georgia. So it's a bit of an irony that, he now stands accused of racketeering under the same act which he used to clean up New York City. So that is why the Georgia indictment, Neha, is so much more significant than even the federal indictment, which was brought by the special investigator Jack Smith, because Georgia used the RICO Act, which allows it to represent this fraud as a collusion, as an enterprise, as a criminal venture. So which means that people like Mr. Giuliani and all the others that have been named, the other 17 people apart from Mr. Giuliani who've been named in this indictment, the risk for Mr. Trump goes up dramatically should one of them actually say that, yes, Mr. Trump asked us to subvert the elections. So that, to my mind, is probably the single biggest challenge, because you don't know who might do a plea deal with the investigators and say that, yes, I'm going to tell you really what happened. And therefore, the investigation and the prosecutor's hands stand strengthened, Neha. So that is really the big risk because of the RICO Act, which Fani Willis has used in coming up with the Georgia indictment against Mr. Trump and 18 others, Neha.
Right. Well, as we said at the start of the show, the legal troubles for Trump keep worsening, but he doesn't look too worried. Because if you ask him, he says he is winning the race by a lot, as he puts it. Thanks for that, Shri. Coming back to you in just a moment to discuss our next story with you. Now, in a stunning development, North Korea has claimed that a US soldier who crossed into the country last month is in its custody, and that he has sought refuge there or in a third country due to, quote, inhuman maltreatment and racial discrimination in the US Army. US Army Private Travis King crossed the military demarcation line into North Korea during a tour to the joint security area in the demilitarized zone separating the two Koreas on the 18th of July. The official Korean Central News Agency said King had admitted that he illegally intruded into North Korean territory, echoing American official statements that he was believed to have crossed the border intentionally. Now, just who is Private Travis King? He is a reconnaissance specialist who has been in the US Army since January 2021 and was in South Korea as part of his rotation. Before crossing the border, he served 2 months in detention in South Korea for assault charges and was released on the 10th of July. King was supposed to fly back to the US to face disciplinary proceedings but managed to leave the airport and join a tour of the demilitarized zone which separates North and South Korea. The DMZ, one of the most heavily fortified areas in the world, is filled with landmines, surrounded by electric and barbed wire fencing and monitored by surveillance cameras. Armed guards are supposed to be on alert 24 hours a day, although witnesses say there were no North Korean soldiers present when King ran over. His family had previously told the US media that he had spoken of experiencing racism in the US Army. They also said his mental health appeared to have declined after he spent time in a South Korean jail. Now, the Korean news agency has reported that during the investigation, Travis King confessed that he had decided to come over to North Korea as he harbored ill feelings against the inhuman maltreatment and racial discrimination that he and many others faced in the US Army. He also expressed his willingness to seek refuge in the DPRK, that's North Korea, or a third country, saying he was disillusioned at the unequal American society. That is the statement that's been released by the North Korean official media. The US says it cannot verify these claims. Concerns have been growing over the welfare of the US soldier who has not been heard from or seen since his crossing. How to classify the 23-year-old has been an open question for the US military. The US is trying to negotiate Private King's release with the help of the UN command that runs the border area and has a direct phone line to the North Korean army. Responding to the North Korean report, a Pentagon official said their priority was to have Private King brought home safely through all available channels. North Korea has given no information on how it plans to treat Private King, but said the soldier admitted he had illegally entered the country. The fact that North Korea's statement emphasized that King's entry was illegal suggests that it is not thinking of having him stay even if he wants to. The statement did not say if Travis King would face prosecution or punishment, and there was no mention of his current whereabouts or condition. North Korea is one of the few countries still under nominally communist rule and has long been a highly secretive and isolated society. Its government, led by Kim Jong-un, stands accused of systemic human rights abuses. Analysts say the detainment of Travis King has played right into North Korea's anti-US messaging at a time when relations between the two countries are at an all-time low. Pyongyang is most likely relishing the opportunity to highlight racism and other shortcomings in American society, especially given the international criticism it receives for its human rights abuses.
We have the Army has launched an investigation into this incident. It's going to be led by Army counterintelligence personnel, and they'll be conducting this in coordination with U.S. Forces Korea. So we, at this moment right now, I can't tell you more about his whereabouts. That's something that the investigation would reveal. Our biggest concern about Private King is that we want to bring him home. And we are doing whatever we can through the interagency from DOD and other partners to find a way that we could bring him home. Again, as you heard me say, we have not heard any contact. We have not received any communication back from the North Koreans, but that is something that remains our focus.
The conversation has commenced with the KPA through the mechanisms of the armistice agreement.
Let's go back to Sri in Washington, D.C. to understand this story better. Sri, there are claims and counterclaims. What exactly should be made of this development? What's interesting is that while the two countries, the US and North Korea, may have their own versions of what exactly happened, there seems to be one area of agreement. They both agree that Travis King entered North Korea intentionally. It was by no means an accident. And then, of course, there is the allegation being made by North Korea that he does not want to return to the US because Travis King has faced racism and discrimination and inhuman treatment within the US Army. All that the US is saying is, we want to bring him back home safely. And then there are reports that he was going to face disciplinary proceedings on his return to the United States. So what should we really make of all these claims and reports that are emerging?
Right. So Neha, the way I see it is, this is a great PR gift wrapped in military uniform sent to Pyongyang by Travis King. So there is no doubt that Mr. King has possibly crossed over of his own volition. But I think the reasons may not be as accurate as what the Central News Agency of North Korea has stated. Because, let's remember that before Mr. King crossed over to North Korea, he was supposed to actually be sent back to the US, Texas in particular, to face disciplinary action for having assaulted an individual in South Korea, and he had served 2 months in prison. So there's no doubt that Mr. King was going through some sort of personal issues, maybe even mental health issues, and that may have prompted him to go over to North Korea in the hope of getting some sort of attention, if not some sort of relief or any kind of hope, but maybe just media attention to his situation. So that could be the reason, Neha. But it's a great PR moment for Mr. Kim Jong-un, and North Korea will milk this to every last drop. But let's quickly look back at the history of US soldiers defecting to North Korea. I mean, there have been only 6 such publicized cases where American soldiers have crossed over, and this has gone on from 1953 itself, when soon after the war, a bunch of American soldiers crossed over to North Korea. And many of them actually ended up acting in North Korea propaganda films on how US is basically a terrible country. It doesn't offer racial equality, discriminates people, blah, 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 and all those things. So basically, they played into the North Korean narrative as willing actors. So in this case, at a time when US and North Korea relations are also strained, in fact, after one of the American students, Otto, who died after he returned, after he was held in North Korea for almost 17 months, he came back to US in a comatose state, he died. US has banned travel to North Korea and has asked North Korea to become more responsible as a nation and also look at its own human rights. So this is a great moment for North Korea to turn around to US and say, I mean, don't preach us, because look at what your own people, and that too a soldier, is saying about North Korea, about your government and your military, that he was harassed, he was discriminated, there's no equality for him. So I think this is just a PR moment. Now to the question of when will Mr. King be released, I have no doubt that North Korea will release him, but they may not do so in a hurry. They may want to milk this PR moment a bit longer before Mr. King is returned, because they really don't want him there, because as a lowly private, as a soldier, he has very little strategic value for North Korea in terms of information. Had it been a general or a senior army officer, then maybe North Korea would have wanted to interrogate him for more military strategic information. But in this case, he's just a small pawn, which has a limited use for North Korea. After that, I have no doubt he'll be sent back to US, Neha.
A gift for North Korea. You know, even though we don't know the entire truth about Travis King's story and we don't know what will become of him eventually, but I find it fascinating that some of these American soldiers, as you just pointed out, seem to actually believe that North Korea is a better country to be in than the United States of America. Wonders never cease. All right, let's now move on to our next story. The International Criminal Court should prosecute Taliban leaders for crimes against humanity for denying education and employment to Afghan girls and women. That is what the United Nations Special Envoy for Global Education has said. Gordon Brown told a virtual UN press conference on the second anniversary of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan on the 15th of August that its rulers are responsible for the most egregious, vicious and indefensible violation of women's rights in the world today. The former British Prime Minister said he has sent a legal opinion to ICC prosecutor Karim Khan that shows the denial of education and employment is gender discrimination, which should count as a crime against humanity, and it should be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court. The Taliban captured power exactly 2 years ago, in August of 2021, during the final weeks of the US and NATO forces' withdrawal from Afghanistan after 20 years of war. As they did during their previous rule of Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001, the Taliban gradually reimposed their harsh interpretation of the Islamic law, the Sharia, barring girls from school beyond the 6th grade and women from most jobs, public spaces, gyms, even beauty salons that have been shut down recently. Gordon Brown has urged major Muslim countries to send a delegation of clerics to Afghanistan's southern city of Kandahar, the home of Taliban Supreme Leader Hibatullah Akhundzada, to make the case that bans on women's education and employment have no basis in the Quran or in Islam, and urged the Taliban to lift these bans. Brown said he believes if there is a split within the regime, with many people in the education ministry and others in Kabul, the capital, who want to see the rights of girls to education restored. He said, I believe that the clerics in Kandahar have stood firmly against that and indeed continue to issue instructions. The Taliban's chief spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid brushed aside questions about restrictions on girls and women in a recent interview, saying the status quo will remain. He also said the Taliban viewed their rule of Afghanistan as open-ended, drawing legitimacy from Islamic law and facing no significant threat. Gordon Brown has also said the Taliban should be told that if girls are allowed to go to secondary school and university again, education aid to Afghanistan, which was cut after the bans were announced, will be restored. He's called for monitoring and reporting on abuses and violations of the rights of women and girls. Sanctions against those directly responsible for these bans included by the US and the UK, and the release of those imprisoned for defending women and girls' rights. He announced that the UN and other organizations will sponsor internet learning for girls and support underground schools, as well as education for Afghan girls who've been forced to leave the country and who need help to go to school. According to him, there's a new initiative to provide curriculum through mobile phones, which are popular in Afghanistan. Now, during the 20 years that the Taliban were out of power, 6 million girls got an education in that country, becoming doctors, lawyers, judges, even members of parliament and cabinet ministers. Today, however, 2.5 million girls are being denied an education. Another 3 million will leave primary school in the next few years. Meanwhile, engineering students Sumaya Faruqi, who had to flee Afghanistan to continue her studies and is now living in the US, is the face of a new campaign launched this week by the UN's Education Cannot Wait Global Fund to combat the crisis, marking the 2-year anniversary of the fall of the internationally recognized government in Kabul. Under the motto, Afghan Girls' Voices, the operation is spearheading a global call to respect all Afghan girls and women's right to education. 21-year-old Faruqi finished high school in Qatar after she and 9 other girls from her robotics team, the Afghan Dreamers, left Afghanistan in 2021. She is now beginning her second year studying engineering at Sacramento State University in California. She says this campaign is meant to bring the attention of the world once again to the girls in Afghanistan and their education. Afghanistan seems to have been forgotten, she says. The Education Cannot Wait campaign will aim to raise global awareness around this issue via social media right into next month, amplifying the voices of Afghan girls and women just as world leaders gather for the UN General Assembly on the 18th and 19th of September. The near total exclusion of women from Afghan public life, including in education and employment, has become one of the major sticking points preventing the international community from offering aid and official recognition to the Taliban regime.
Today marks 2 years since the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, reminds the de facto authorities that Afghanistan, as a state, has obligations under international law to respect, uphold, and promote the rights of all people without discrimination. We remain deeply troubled by the human rights situation, in particular the severe restrictions imposed on women and girls whose rights to access education and work, their freedom of movement and participation in daily and public life have been eroded by a series of discriminatory edicts issued since the takeover. The High Commissioner calls on the international community not to forget the people of Afghanistan, who, in addition to facing severe limitations on their human rights, are living through a dire humanitarian and economic situation.
All right, let's go back to Shri at this point. Shri, there is no doubt that everyone who had said that this was Taliban 2.0, it was probably going to be a more modern or reformed Taliban, now has egg on their faces, because what the Taliban have done in the last 2 years is to take the country, especially the women and girls of Afghanistan, right back to the Stone Age. The question is that while nobody can disagree with what the UN envoy for global education, Gordon Brown, is saying, what has the international community really done in concrete or tangible terms to pressurize the Taliban regime into restoring the girls' and women's right to education and employment? All we've had so far is a refusal to acknowledge or grant legitimacy to the Taliban regime. And the young girl we just quoted in this story, Samaya Faruqi, is quite right in saying that Afghanistan seems to have been all but forgotten by the world.
Unfortunately, Neha, she's right. I don't think the international community has done enough to restore women's rights in Afghanistan. The way I see it, what's going on in Afghanistan right now is a systematic gender apartheid against women. Women comprise almost half of Afghanistan population. They are 48% of the country's population. And what Taliban wants to do is basically make them invisible. They're telling women not to be visible in public spaces, not to be visible in employment, not to be visible in malls. Basically, they just want to make sure that these women disappear. Now, how do you make that happen? Or how can you make that happen? How can international community allow that to happen in a country like Afghanistan, where 50% of the population, almost half the population, is at stake? So I think there is a lot of lever which the international community can pull if it is serious about helping the situation of women in Afghanistan. Now, let's look at Afghanistan's situation today. People below poverty in Afghanistan, 98%. That's a staggering number. So almost everyone in Afghanistan is living in poverty, right? And it's in desperate need of aid. So the international community can very easily start giving aid, but subject to certain conditions. And one of those conditions ought to be that women will have their rights restored, that they will have the right to go to colleges, get educated, employment. So these are certain things the international community can insist. Because, Neha, it's very clear that women form one of the most important pillar of any healthy, vibrant peaceful society. If you subjugate women like this, then you're not just subjugating a handful of women or even 50% of your population, but you are condemning generations of population to a mindset where this becomes the norm, where it becomes acceptable. So this is a systematic degradation of women as humans, as individuals with rights. So I think the international community does need to come together to put pressure on Afghanistan in return for aid and make sure that women get their fair share of living, simple living, not even any fancy rights, but basic living rights. That even Quran, I heard you talk about Taliban referring to Quran and Sharia as the basis for all these actions, but that's wrong. Islamic scholars are very clear that nowhere has Quran spoken against educating women. In fact, there are many hadiths where Prophet Muhammad talks about how life, right to property, right to life, right to think, which includes intellect and education, is fundamental to all women in Islam. So this is some bogus claim which Taliban is using to subjugate women based on some improper understanding of what Quran actually teaches, Neha.
Absolutely. Fact is, Sri, it's been 2 years of a living hell for the women and girls of Afghanistan. They are clearly staring at a very dark future, and the international community needs to be reminded that it cannot look the other way anymore. Let's certainly hope that something changes for these women and girls. On that note, Sri, thank you so much for joining us. As always, it was an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Neha.
All right, time for us to slip into a quick break here on Global Lens. Don't go anywhere. There's lots more coming up on the other side.
BrahMos, stealthy, lethal, precise. It flies at 3 times the speed of sound and cuts through a warship